I'm thrilled to be joined now by Karol Markowicz, New York Post columnist and host of the Karol Markowicz Show. Karol, thanks so much for coming on the U.S. Report. I wanted to start with this story here out of New York. And if we all remember those anti-Israel protesters from last year, well, they seem to be back at New York's Barnard College. They were handing out pamphlets written by the Hamas media office justifying October 7th. Here's a little bit of their protest storming the library. Sorry, I thought that footage was from Ramallah there for a second. How is this to be tolerated at the country's colleges? And is the Trump administration now starting to push back with threats to withhold funding from schools that allow this nonsense to continue?
Well, I hope they do withhold funding because this has gone on long enough. Columbia and Barnard have shown that they're completely incapable of stopping this insanity. Jewish students don't feel safe on campus. They've been targeted for harassment and for worse, and that includes also Jewish professors. So the fact that this is allowed to go on, we're in the second year of this, it's really not acceptable. No other group it would be okay to do this too. Like, you know, somebody commented if the KKK was marching outside of black dorms, people would understand that that's a problem. But Jewish students are continually harassed like this on college campuses like Columbia. And I think they should lose their funding. And I hope that the Trump administration goes through with that.
Look, I agree with you completely on that, and I think especially a lot of these universities that have become hedge funds with a sideline in handing out diplomas really need to have a bit of a wake-up call on some of their finances. But what do you say to people who say, well, you know, you need to also do this with an eye towards keeping free speech together? I mean, the United States does have the First Amendment. There are going to be people who say, well, look, come on, it's a protest. It's okay. It's First Amendment.
Sure. I'd like their address so I can go protest inside their home or inside their place of work, just like that, because that is not what the First Amendment's all about. You can say whatever you want. You can stand outside the building and say whatever you want. You cannot enter private buildings and harass students on campus. You're not allowed to graffiti things. You're not allowed to take over buildings the way that they did last year. None of that is covered by the First Amendment. The fact that we have freedom of speech, it means I'll defend your right to say whatever you want and not be arrested for it. I will not defend your right to go into school libraries and bang drums and harass students. I'm sorry, that's not the First Amendment.
Yeah, no, look, you're absolutely right about that, Karol. And I think, you know, we've seen an awful lot of what actual violations of the First or of the principles of free speech are. You just have to go look at J.D. Vance's speech to the Europeans the other week about what real violations of free speech are in places like that. I wanted to talk also about this story, which I absolutely loved here. You know how Donald Trump has appointed himself to the board of the Kennedy Center, which is the great performance arts space in Washington, D.C. And, of course, everybody has gone absolutely feral about this. And if you needed a perfect example of Trump derangement syndrome, this is it. Remember the award-winning musical Hamilton, where they had founding father Alexander Hamilton as a black guy, and he was doing rap and all of this stuff? Well, they've confirmed they're not going to let the musical run again at the JFK Center for Performing Arts because of President Trump's takeover of the venue. What do you make of that?
I think it's very rich because they said that they don't want to continue the show there because they're not about partisanship and politics. But if people recall, Mike Pence, vice president, the first Trump go-around, went to see the Hamilton show and was booed by the people on the stage. So they do politics sometimes, and they certainly enjoyed performing for Barack Obama. I think politics is not really the problem here. It's a very leftist organized performance. Lin-Manuel Miranda, very well-known leftist activist. I love the show. It got my kids into history. I love hip hop. I enjoyed it. I think it's disappointing that they're doing this because people will miss out. But, you know, it is them choosing partisanship over their own performance.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, I want to talk to you, too, because we had just overnight here in Australia, we had confirmation hearings for Jay Bhattacharya as the director of the National Institutes of Health. Well, it's fascinating here because Dr. Jay Bhattacharya was one of the great COVID skeptics and one of the great lockdown skeptics. Now, you moved to Florida from New York, I believe, in part because of some of the lunacy that was going on in New York during that period. He was one of the Barrington Declaration scientists. And here's the fascinating thing. During his hearings, the whole question of lockdowns, which he was so against, they never came up. They didn't get challenged. He didn't get challenged by Democrats. Do you think this is now finally an admission that the lockdown COVID skeptics were right?
Well, you know it is, right? We were in New York, I think you and I are around the same time, and it was a crazy place to be. Things just got crazier and crazier. Restaurants would be open here, but not over here. It was a real just insane thing to do, and the lockdowns clearly didn't work. And what we're seeing 5 years later, especially with Jay Bhattacharya not being asked any questions whatsoever about his position on lockdowns, is that everybody wants to pretend now that they were against the lockdowns, that everybody wanted to open schools, for example, when I know that I was writing article after article in the New York Post saying we need to reopen schools. Kids are going to suffer. They're going to have long-term, disadvantages if the people who don't get to send their kids to school. At the time, it was a very contentious thing to say, but now I can't find a single person who disagrees with that. I mean, some of the people who particularly kept school closed, like Randy Weingarten, the head of a teachers union here, she now says she wanted to open schools the whole time. I love that Jay Bhattacharya is up for this role. I love that he's going to be in that position. He deserves it. He was a voice of sanity and reason, and he was very steady during a time where people lost their minds. So I'm loving it. I hope he does a great job, and I know he will.
Yeah, and we had him on Sky News an awful lot. He was this is one of the first places that he came on when the pandemic started to hit. He was always a voice of reason. And Karol Markowicz, so are you. Thank you so much for joining me on the U.S. Report tonight.